In an earlier video, we began our coverage of oppression by distinguishing between prejudice, discrimination, racism, and institutionalized racism and discrimination. A key question, however, has to do with why racial oppression exists in the first place. There are a couple different theories on this, including the structural and cultural perspectives, and those who, like W.E.B. Du Bois, combine them together. So we're going to lay out these theories, starting with what's called the cultural perspective. This perspective is one that I'm sure you're very familiar with because it's the dominant explanation for racism offered within our popular culture. However, while it will have an inherent appeal to you because of its familiarity, from a sociological perspective, it's rather problematic. So get ready to engage your critical thinking. Those who take a cultural perspective on social inequality argue that racism and discrimination exist because of people's attitudes, values, and beliefs. The argument here is that people have developed prejudices toward those who are different, and the result is racism. This is where the process of the construction of other through the separation of in and out groups comes into play. Because of people's individual prejudices, we have created a culture characterized by prejudice and racism. Then, because racism leads to discrimination, the result is a society, a social structure that's characterized by a system of stratification, inequality, and oppression. Again, this cultural explanation for racial oppression is one that's pretty familiar to us because it's the one we hear repeated over and over within our culture. Racial oppression is the result of people's prejudices. So the culture comes first, and then based on this culture, we structure all of society. So the social structure is the outcome. However, those who take a structuralist perspective disagree, considering this to be a rather simplistic explanation. Structuralists recognize that prejudice and racism don't just come out of thin air. These belief systems must be created, which means they have a purpose. The question is, what purpose do they serve? To understand how, we have to take a step back for a moment and look at the structure of society. So now we're going to take a structuralist perspective. Structuralists recognize that we inhabit a stratified society. Moreover, what creates inequality is not our prejudices. There are plenty of bigoted people, for example, who still live on the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. So prejudice and racism do not create inequality, as culturalists would have us believe. In fact, quite the opposite. Inequality creates the need for bigotry. I'll say that again. Inequality creates the need for bigotry. What allows some people to get ahead is not their attitudes, values, and beliefs. It's the fact that they often start out with an advantage based on their pre-existing position within the system of stratification. Basically, the arrow was pointing in the wrong direction. From the structural perspective, inequality is based on the fact that some groups have better opportunities before them than other groups do. In other words, there are unequal opportunity structures. For example, some people have resources available to them, whether it's power, knowledge, money, influence, skills, land, technology, connections, or whatever. Possessing these kinds of resources gives them an advantage over other people. And once a group has such an advantage, they work to both exploit and justify that advantage in order to secure their position. Those in positions of relative power and economic security begin to exploit the resources available to them. But this is done at the expense of other groups. They exploit the land and they exploit other people, particularly through their labor. However, this raises moral questions. How is it that the group in power can exploit other people and still sleep comfortably at night with a clear conscience? You basically have to justify your actions. You have to provide a rationale in order to lend legitimacy to your exploitative actions. And this is done by changing one's attitudes toward those you exploit. If it's morally reprehensible to exploit and enslave human beings, you can't allow yourself or other members of your group to think of them as human beings in the first place. You have to dehumanize them, making them subhuman. You have to believe that they are incapable of anything greater than taking on a servile position. In other words, prejudice and racism are created in order to justify the existing system of stratification and exploitation within society. I'm going to say that again because it's so important. Prejudice and racism are created in order to justify the existing system of stratification and exploitation within society. Racism is not the original cause of discrimination and oppression. Instead, racism is the justification for the use of discrimination and oppression to exploit others and secure one's position at the top of the hierarchy. In other words, the culture of racism and prejudicial values is the result of the existing structure of inequality, and racism itself represents an ideological system used by the powerful to legitimate the status quo, the oppressive hierarchy that places them in positions of power in the first place. Okay, we now have two contrasting perspectives on social inequality, the cultural and structural perspectives. But then there are those sociologists, like Du Bois, who combine them together. It's a simple modification, and here's how it works. Once a culture of racism is created, it legitimates and contributes to further inequality and oppression, so that the result is a self-reinforcing system. But even when combining these perspectives, sociologists like Du Bois recognize that this system starts with inequality, exploitation, and oppression. In other words, the structures of oppression are the driving force behind this entire system. Prejudice and racism are then introduced in order to justify inequality, but they do more than that. They also reinforce and perpetuate that inequality. Okay, I know this is rather abstract, so during class we'll examine some different examples. Overall, we've learned about 3 different perspectives intended to explain the origins of oppression, specifically racial oppression. They include the cultural perspective, the structural perspective, and the combination of these two together. Again, W.B. Du Bois takes both a cultural and a structural perspective to the topic of racial oppression. In the next video, we'll focus on his model of cultural oppression. Then, when we get to conflict theory, we'll take a look at his contributions to the structural perspective on oppression.